welcome to the Overby Center for Southern Journalism and Politics. This is the fourth in a series of programs that the Overby Center is holding this year, dealing with social unrest in America in the 1960s that culminated in those historic explosions of 1968, including the assassination of Senator Robert F. Kennedy, who at that time was running for the presidency. And I'm delighted that the person we have with us today is Ellen Meacham from our own faculty, who's the author of Delta. Ellen has written a book called Delta Epiphany. And you can actually, by the way, you can actually buy it right out there after this is over with. But it's about RFK's dramatic tour of the Mississippi Delta in 67? When he was in the state for congressional hearings on hunger. And she has talked a lot about what happened to Kennedy, what the visit did to him. And before she jumps into it very deeply, I should mention that there's a reception afterward. There's rumored there may be pizza there. And Ellen is going to kick us off with some slides. No, you go right there. That's fine.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bill. I'm really happy to be here tonight. And I'm especially happy to see the students here, even though some of them I know are required to come. But I'm especially happy to see you here because in a way, I wrote this book with you in mind, with my students in mind. And it was very important for me to write a book that was that told a story and that was accessible and didn't assume that you knew a whole lot about the civil rights movement or about the time, that time 50 years ago. And so, but, you know, it's a fine line to walk because you don't want to insult your readers either who do know what those are. So, but as I was writing and as I was researching, I tried to imagine sort of a composite student in my mind, and that's who I was sort of talking to and think of it as telling a story. So I'm glad to see y'all here today. So this book, my book, focuses on Robert Kennedy's visit to the Mississippi Delta in 1967, and it sort of came about because in April of '67, Robert Kennedy knelt on the floor in a shack in Cleveland, Mississippi, and tried to get a response out of this child. It was a toddler who was picking up each little grain of rice and beans and cornbread and was really not interested in this man in the fine suit, the senator. And Kennedy tried for several minutes to get this child to respond, tickling it, say, hey baby, and the child was very listless, and you could see the results of malnutrition on his body, some sores, bloated stomach, so forth. And as Kennedy left, he walked out and talked to the news media and was clearly moved, telling them that America can do better, that this was not a Mississippi problem, not just a Mississippi problem, it was an American problem. And that it was unacceptable, and that was a word that he used a lot. If something was just unacceptable, it just had to be addressed. So I read this passage in Curtis Wilkie's book, Dixie, his memoir of his time as a reporter, and I couldn't shake the image. I was really struck by it. It was only a page or so in the book, but I came back to it in my mind a lot, and I wondered a couple of things. I wondered what impact this had had on Robert Kennedy personally and politically. And then I also wondered, the second question that came right after that was, what happened to the baby? What happened to that child? Because we know, unfortunately, what happened to Robert Kennedy in the next 14 or 15 months. But I didn't know anything about what happened to the child. And it seemed like an impossible task, but it sort of consumed me. So I started on this journey trying to find the child and trying to look at what this moment meant. And I felt like it is a useful lens. His trip is a useful lens to look at what was going on then, what's going on now, and that they would tell the story. So I'm just going to show a few slides. I've got some numbers that thankfully I'm not going to read the PowerPoint to you, I hope. But I'll just talk a little bit about it so that you have a context for what was going on and how he got there. And then Bill's going to ask me a few questions, and then I'll open it up to you guys. So in 1967, Robert Kennedy was in the Senate, and he had already been through running his brother's presidential campaign, a very close campaign. He'd served as Attorney General. He was Attorney General during some pivotal times, the Civil Rights Movement, as we know, on this very campus, doing some things right, making some mistakes, and learning a lot about America, and especially about the disadvantages that African Americans faced in Jim Crow South. So his brother is assassinated, he's devastated for a while, and then he decides to run for Senate from New York. And even though he was accused of being a carpetbagger and was in a way, clearly not that much of a permanent resident of New York, he had spent a lot more time. I didn't realize he'd spent a lot more time there as a child. He spent a lot of his elementary school years in New York. His parents moved. He was born in Boston area, and they moved him and the family to New York until they went to England as ambassadors, because, in a large part, because some of the prejudice that was going on in Boston towards Irish Americans at the time. But he was serving on the Senate subcommittee, and that's what brought him to Mississippi. And one of the big things I learned about this trip, I went into it thinking it was like any other kind of poverty tour that we see in America and internationally, where someone with a reputation or a following, some celebrity, goes to an impoverished area to call attention to the problem, and in a way also calls attention to themselves. And I sort of expected that to be part of the deal here. But as I started reading the news clips and looking at the films and reading about it, I realized that his trip here was different. It was kind of more akin to a fact-finding mission. That he was on the Senate subcommittee. There were programs from the War of Poverty that were coming up for reauthorization, and this committee was looking at them holding hearings everywhere. And they started with a hearing in Washington, and a young woman from Mississippi. Well, she was not originally; she's from South Carolina, but a woman came from Mississippi to testify. And there's Marion Wright testifying in Washington. And one of the things I want the young people to know tonight and to notice is that how old do y'all think she was here? Oh, 27 years. Well, see, I like to ask quizzes that you'll make an A on. So she was 27 years old. And so she had not been out of law school very long. She'd gone to Yale Law School and had a pivotal experience in Mississippi in '64 as part of the Freedom Summer, and came back determined to practice law in Mississippi. Was not really a fan of law school, but because of what she experienced visiting on spring break in '64, as she watched some elderly people and children have the dogs sicked on them and beaten and hauled off to the courthouse without a trial and to the jail, she was determined to come back to Mississippi, and she was one of only 5 African American lawyers in the state at the time. She represented Head Start, which was one of these poverty programs, and she went up to testify about that because Senator Stennis, who was from Mississippi and represented Mississippi, had waited about 8 days after Head Start began to investigate them in Mississippi. And so they had been under fire for quite a while. And she was there to testify and answer some of those charges. But she went off topic. She talked about those things, answered the questions, but then she looked at the senators sitting up there, those 5 powerful men, older men, and she looked at them and said, people are hungry in the Mississippi Delta, and we don't know what we're going to do to get them through the winter, and somebody needs to do something. And she looked right at Kennedy and the others, and she was very straightforward. And if you've met her or seen her in recent years, she is a real powerhouse, and she must have been then too, because they paused, they started questioning, and part of what she was asserting that some of the war on poverty programs made things worse, had made things worse in the Delta, not better. And some of these well-meaning programs that had maybe a positive impact nationally because of the way they played out in the economy, the cotton economy of the Delta, had actually intensified the problem. And so they took a break, went off the record, looking at the transcript, and came back and said, okay, we're going to hold our next hearing in Mississippi. And so that's how they came. And so Kennedy's visit brought out a wide divide of reactions in Mississippi. He was kind of a lightning rod. And because of what had happened at the University of Mississippi, because of the reports and the way that the news media, especially the pro-segregationist news media, had covered those events in the newspapers, he was deeply, deeply disliked by many white Mississippians. Not all, but many white Mississippians. And so he's met at the airport by the Klan. And anybody know who that is in the photograph? He was a long-time sort of gadfly in Mississippi. Richard Barrett. Yeah, and so those of you who covered Mississippi in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and so forth, he was always protesting something, and usually on the wrong side of justice. But so they have the hearings in Jackson. They hold them in Jackson, and Stennis, because he's because he's the sitting senator and they're in his state, as a courtesy, they let him testify first. And he had built it up as he is going to really let Head Start have it. He is really going to, they televised it and broadcast it over the radio in Jackson and other parts of the state, that he was going to show how disgraceful these poverty programs were, what a terrible waste of money. And Kennedy had an audit done by Arthur Anderson, and as Stennis was testifying, Kennedy said, well, I have this audit here, and he pulled it out and he starts flipping through and reading from it and saying only very minor mistakes in accounting and so forth, and completely dismantled Stennis's argument. And he kind of blusters and says, well, yeah, I haven't seen that. And but Marian Wright is even more adamant when she testifies that people are hungry, that there's an unfolding catastrophe in Mississippi. They hear a lot of statistics from state officials, and when they ask her about what Senator Stennis said, she just looks directly at him and says, he is wrong. And which was a very brave thing to do for a young African American in Mississippi in 1967, to contradict the sitting senator from the state, there in the state and in an audience. Unita Blackwell and Fannie Lou Hamer, 2 women who were really active at the local level in the civil rights movement, and pressing for voting rights and for desegregation and for all kinds of social justice. They testified and told about their experiences with Head Start and about the children, and Unita Blackwell especially painted a very dire picture of the children in her district. And she said, Senator Stennis is there talking about programs, but we have children who've never even had a glass of milk. And so they spoke about the realities that they lived, that their neighbors lived, and what they had seen. Another interesting thing was, some of you may know the artist William Dunlap. So he talked his way. He was a senior at Mississippi College, and he skipped a Bible class and told them that he was a sketch artist, and especially back in those days in the courtroom they didn't allow cameras, and so they would have sketch artists who would sketch what was going on in hearings and so forth, and so they let him go sit on the front, and so he sketched him. And he saw a friend of mine post something about my work on Facebook, and he emailed me and said, I have this, if you would like to use it, you're welcome to use it. And I called him, and I got a really great story for him, because it was a very moving moment for him. It was the first interracial, there was about 1,000 people that came to the hearing, and it was the first interracial audience he'd ever been in, and he was just surprised and moved, and so kind of an electric environment there at the hearing, and he had some really interesting. So the next day they take a flight to Greenville, and they started at the Air Force Base to look at job training programs. And one of the things that I also found is that Kennedy was, he was a former prosecutor, and he was also a rich man's son, someone who had had people trying to kind of make up with him and trying to influence him all of his life, manipulate him. And he he pulled Bill Miner aside and some other journalists and said, okay, who of these people can I trust? Can I trust Marion Wright? Who's going to tell me the truth? And ask him about the different activists and people who would be leading the tour and so forth. When he got to Greenville, he was extremely frustrated because the head of the program couldn't tell him if anyone had actually gotten any jobs or if there were any jobs available once this job training program finished. And he was quite short and sort of abrupt with them. And Dan Shore, who was a CBS reporter, he described Kennedy's manner on the trip, which I was quite surprised by. Now, as the way it's portrayed now was his, sort of his compassion and so forth. He described his manner as an inspector general, that he was asking tough questions, that Kennedy was here in the Mississippi Delta, the report he filed the night, he said here he's acting as an inspector general, because he asked a lot of hard questions about how things operated, what their impact was, and so forth. So one of the places he went was Head Start, and a couple of numbers here that really stunned me. Mississippi had a population of almost 2 million at the time, and in 1960, 160,000 of the adults over 25 had no more than a 4th grade education, and another 40,000 had no education at all. And so to me, that helped me understand the context of today as we struggle with education issues in Mississippi, just kind of where the state was starting from. So you can see the Head Start family incomes were about $400 a year. So Kennedy went into the homes, and after this home, he asked the photographers not to go in anymore because he felt like it was disrespectful. So this is the only photo we have inside a home of him, and talking and interacting. And that was another thing that was kind of different from what I expected when you have these, you have Angelina Jolie and so forth going in and picking up, the sad baby and so forth. But he actually didn't. He wanted to interact with these families without, the print media was in there, some of the reporters, but no cameras. And so he would ask questions like, what did you have for breakfast? How do you feed the children? Where do you get your food? Can you get food stamps? What have you had? He would go into, and he made unscheduled stops too. That was the other thing that surprised me. He didn't want to be led around to just the places that the activists and civil rights leaders wanted him to see. He wanted to see if what was real. And so he would ask if he could come in, ask if he could look in their cabinets, their refrigerator even, and he found some awfully bare cupboards. So I'm going to go a little more quickly here, but this is at Freedom City, which I didn't know about until I started working on it, but was a kind of a collective farm that was designed by the Delta Ministry to help displaced farm workers buy land and work it together. And this was a group, and the woman in the striped dress. She was one of the ones I found and interviewed later, and she was about 17, and she had amazingly clear memories. And one of the things I'll say, I don't think she'd ever told the story before, and everything she said matched exactly with the historical record that I had about Freedom City and about what happened, and so she was extremely helpful. Now, then they went on to Cleveland, and here you see some photographs. This is a family of 15, the Dillard family, and Charlie Dillard is the boy that you only see half of him leaning against the cabin. This is one of the only, he really doesn't have any photographs of himself as a child. So this is, I found this through my research. And so really the only one that he even has is this one where he's just halfway there. But their mother had been a farm worker, and she'd actually gone to Florida to look for work when Kennedy came, and they were staying with their grandparents, who had children of their own, plus other grandchildren staying there. And this is their house. So as Kennedy was touring Cleveland, he around the corner came the newspaper editor, Cliff Langford, from the Cleveland paper, and he said, "What the heck do you think you're doing here, Senator Kennedy?" And Senator Kennedy said, "Well, I'm looking around." And he said, "Well, I'm looking at how poverty programs work." I said, "Well, why don't you go back up to New York? Why don't you go to Harlem and look? Why are you coming to the worst part of town? Let me take you to the nicer part of town. This is just trying to make us look bad." But he had this conversation with Langford, and towards the very end of my research, I found a clip, an actual video clip of it, so I was able to get the exact dialogue. And in people's memory, it was Cotton Carter and Bill Rose's, and Curtis's. It was very confrontational, and it was confrontational in the video, but you could see that Kennedy, at one point, Kennedy says, Langford says, "We don't have any hungry people here. Nobody's starving here." And he said, "Well, step over here and I'll introduce you to some," and pointed to the Dillard children. And so at a certain point, though, Langford, said, "I've had to deal with this all my life." And he just looks down and kind of like, for a moment, he just sort of broke his shell, and it looked like Langford was kind of considering and thinking, and sort of, he calmed him back down a little bit. But so Annie White's family, they had 6 children that you can see. And Curtis wrote in his story that there was the toddler on the floor picking up the rice and beans, and that there was a 3-month-old baby on the bed with a bottle propped up on a pile of rags. And so about 2 weeks before I was turning in my manuscript, I came across another set of photos and contact sheets, if you're old enough to remember what those were. Those are like the film strips that are developed. And at the end of that set, there was this photo of this baby, and I know y'all can't tell really here, but it took my breath away. It was this baby who's lying on the bed with a bottle propped up on rags. And Gorovich, the photographer, apparently slipped back in looking at the contact sheets. Kennedy had come out, and he apparently slipped back in and took that photo. It never ran anywhere. It hadn't been seen anywhere before. So the last stop was in Clarksdale, and they only stopped there for a little bit. And he looked at common opportunities. But you can see he landed with the KKK handing out flyers predicting his death. And 48 hours later, he's standing there, and you have all of these hands reaching out to touch him. And Bill Miner, the longtime Mississippi journalist, said it was like people trying to touch the robes of Christ. They were just wanting to touch him so badly. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to leave with this and photo from the Jim Lucas collection, and sit down and let Bill ask some questions.
So the interesting thing to me about this, Ellen, is This was a period of time in America when the news media had really come into its own. And they played a major role in the civil rights movement. And they were played to a certain extent by the civil rights movement as well. But television had come onto the scene as a real force in the 1950s, probably television news with the Little Rock desegregation crisis. 101st Airborne soldiers with bayonets fixed, protecting these few black students from a howling mob. And those images were just seared into the American consciousness. And then the hard print journalists were just scouring the South for stories at the same time. So you had this real powerful force in the media. And I'm wondering what impact the press and journalism had on Kennedy's visit.
Well, it was, I guess that's a little too loud. One of the first things I did when I started doing this is trying to collect and track down every news story I could find about the event. And it was quite striking to look and see. There was, an Associated Press, national folks there, Associated Press reporter, and there was a New York Times stringer. I don't think he was a full-time staffer, and some other, the Times Picayune, Bill Miner, and a few other more national folks. But there was also quite a bit of regional press and local press, and the difference between the way the two covered it was quite striking. Especially the local press to the Cleveland paper and the Jackson paper, not so much the Greenville paper because it was more moderate. And Curtis's stories, he said that they pretty much let him write the way he wanted to write. Some of the editorial attitudes were different. In Clarksdale. But several of the papers wrote stories that were very defensive and looked at it in terms of why did Kennedy come here, and sort of portraying as Kennedy making a play for Democratic voters. And you had to understand that in 65 the Voting Rights Act had passed, so there were the African Americans in Mississippi and the Delta were suddenly moving from people who'd been disenfranchised and not allowed to participate, except maybe in very small numbers in some places, to the potential of a pretty powerful voting force. And so, I think that the images that came out of it, especially Daniel Shore's report, he was the only national television person on the trip. And his wife told me he really had to argue to get to go on the trip. But it kind of launched this discussion about hunger in America, and there was later a documentary made. And much of the images that Americans saw on their television were very prosperous in post-war America. And so to see photos and images of people like the Dillard family, then they were quite kind of shocked. And so it stimulated a lot more coverage about the issue.
How did what all these journalists wrote and the photos they shot shape and inform what you wrote?
Well, I was extremely lucky to find two different caches of mostly pretty much unpublished photographs of Kennedy's visit. And the first one was the photos of Jim Lucas, who was a freelance photographer, just either still in at Millsaps or just out of Millsaps. And he had gotten there, and he was there from the time Kennedy pretty much landed all the way until Greenville. And so he had about 400 or 500 shots of the trip that were just like a movie strip almost. And his widow, he had died really young, and his widow was developing them and trying to he'd taken a lot of civil rights movement photos, and she actually has a book coming out at the same time. She let me have the contact sheets, and they were such a rich source of being able to describe it, because I wanted to tell it as a narrative, like a story, and to be able to describe the setting. You could see how Kennedy, the folks on the porch I was able to describe by looking at the contact sheets. You could see when Kennedy walks up in this frame by frame thing, as he walks up, in each frame, they walk from one side of the porch over to meet him. And so I wouldn't have even been able to describe that because it wasn't on film anywhere, describe that kind of thing. So that helped. And then right at the end, I found the photographs that I showed you of the Dillard family. And in Cleveland, and Dan Grovich was the only photographer that I found that was in Cleveland, and I figured out what happened was all of the AP photographer and the other photographers all left to file their photos for the afternoon papers. So they took the stuff in Greenville, there was a lunch, and they all peeled off, and Grovich wasn't taking photos for a newspaper, so he stayed and followed him all through through Cleveland, and so they're just, I couldn't have imagined that scene with the children standing there. I couldn't have imagined that if I had to try to sort of recreate that without looking at it. It would have been too hard and too. I wouldn't have had any faith that it would be true. So it made a big difference.
One of the things that struck me at the time, and has always struck me as I've gone back to it about this, is here were these very poor people at the time when segregation was at its most intense in Mississippi, and they were hopelessly ensconced in poverty. Couldn't imagine a world outside of where they were, and all of a sudden a car stops and all these people throng into their yard and into their house, and here's a United States senator, and they're amazed and bewildered.
They are.
Bewildered and stunned. So, but that was a long time ago.
Right.
How did you track down these families and these children?
Well, so I started with the news articles and tried to cull them from cull every name I could find that said that Kennedy talked to. And that was hard because especially the Mississippi papers would rarely gave their name and just said he spoke with the term that they used then, spoke with a Negro woman outside of Clarksdale, or he's a Negro man. And I felt very strongly from the beginning that these folks, I didn't want to write a story where Kennedy was just Saint Kennedy comes into the stage of the poverty. And they had been sort of relegated to the poverty set, even in the national papers. Even though they talked about it in all of his biographies, I really wanted to find the names. And so then I started looking in phone books and talking to people and knocking on doors and trying to find. So I found Catherine, who was the girl on the porch in the striped dress, just by going out and knocking on doors in the area.
Sheila reported.
That's right. And then I was really stumped. It took me 7 years to find the family, Annie White's family, where the baby was on the floor, where he got down on it. And I was really stumped with that, and I put an ad in the paper. And someone called and said, one of the White, because their last name was White. It was really, and somebody called me and said, one of her children is in a nursing home in Cleveland. And I thought, well, I'm not going to be able to get in there. So I just kept looking, and I thought, I'm going to call one of the pastors that I'd worked with who was there and I'd interviewed and see if they'll put a note in the church bulletin about who I'm looking for. So when I called, the lady there said, I do the nursing home ministry. Yeah, I'll take you down there. And so I did. So I walked into his room to talk to him, and I said, did Robert Kennedy come to visit you? And he said, yeah, we were sitting on the floor eating beans and rice and cornbread. And I knew, that's when I had chills. I was like, okay, I found them. This is the right family. And then he gave me his brother and sister's names, and I really interviewed more of them, but and his wife helped me find that. So, and then Mr. Dillard was in the phone book. So, so it was just a kind of variety of things.
I love that story because it's a real object lesson for our students, and the value of shoe leather reporting, and you keep coming up with ideas. But you became obsessed with this.
I guess you could say that, yeah.
Why was it so important to you to find these children?
Well, I thought it was only half of the story, and I thought that the efforts, especially interviewing Edna White, whose mother was Annie White, she was about 10 years old when Kennedy came through. And she wasn't actually there, but her brothers were. But she could tell me, we met at McDonald's, and we stayed there for about 3 hours. And it took her a while, but she could tell me, what was a daily life like for your mother? How did she wash? Because she was washing clothes when Kennedy came in, the reporter said. So I'd say, what would she do in the morning when she got you up? And it was really heartbreaking to hear how her struggle, how she would go, if she didn't have food to give them, which many times in the morning she didn't, she would go from house to house and get a little bit of beans and a little bit of rice or whatever she could borrow or trade and make sure they had one meal of the day. And that's what they were eating when Kennedy came in. It was after school and they were eating. And so it became, I didn't want to just tell a story about Robert Kennedy. I wanted to tell a story about women and children and families.
You know, the general public really doesn't, and anybody really who's not worked in journalism, they don't really know what all goes into tracking people down and overcoming obstacles.
It's really fun. It's actually really fun to me.
Talk to me about overcoming some of the obstacles and into finding these people and getting them to talk to you.
Yes, because people almost immediately say, "Oh, it was just a thing. You know, it was just a day. When nothing much happened. You know, I can't tell you how many people say, "Oh, I don't know much about it." It was, and then when you start to talk to them, they start to warm up. You start to pull out all these amazing details from them. But I really had to go because I was telling stories. I'm a white woman telling the stories. Many times, all of them were people of color. And I was very conscious of wanting to navigate that in a respectful way and communicate to them that I wasn't just there to exploit their story, that I felt like actually there had been a wrong done to them by not telling that. Sometimes I showed them some of my previous work. I just called them and talked to them about how much. I mean, if you talk to somebody about how important their mother was, they're going to talk to you usually. And so the other thing is, and I ask advice from other people of color, to make sure. And one friend gave me some really good advice. She said, they're going to be scared of what you're going to write. She said, tell them they can read it before you write it, which is not something I would do if I were covering the mayor or the governor or something. But in this instance, I was totally okay with that. And once I told them that, they didn't take anything. They changed it, like you got this name wrong or something. But once I told them that, they were much more comfortable talking to me too. But it took a while. It took a while of calling and bugging and that kind of thing.
Did you have any trouble getting them to talk on the phone?
I just went to them. Yeah, I just went to them.
Always better.
Always better. I didn't even try to do it on the phone. The only ones I did on the phone were people like some of Kennedy's former aides. And then there was one doctor, Coles, who had been sent down the next week by the Field Foundation to do a survey with another doctor's survey to verify what Kennedy said he had found in terms of malnutrition. And I went to Boston to go to the archives, and Dr. Coles, somehow we were supposed to meet. He was 80-something. He doesn't have voicemail. He doesn't have email. He doesn't have an answering machine. He has a landline. And so I'd written him a letter, and he said, I'll meet you at this, the Minuteman, diner or whatever. And so I drove up to Concord, and he never showed up. And I went out to his house. He never showed up. But he was really important because he was close to Kennedy, and he talked a lot about Kennedy's reaction to Mississippi. And so I don't know how many years that whenever I had a minute in my office, I would just dial his number. And I dialed it and dialed it and dialed it. And then one Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock, he answered the phone. Mm-hmm. I mean, after years of just dialing that number randomly at random times. And so I interviewed him right there. And so he's still hard to get on the phone. But he's, as far as I know, he's still alive and ready to read the book.
One of the great things about journalists and about authors is that they learn constantly along their journey. They learn things about themselves. They learn things about what they're reporting on. They learn things about the region that they take place in, these events take place in. How about you? Tell us about what you learned about Mississippi, about journalism, about yourself.
Well, I mean, it's hard to say that I actually learned this part, but I was it was reinforced and reminded again that Mississippi is a place of amazing storytellers of all races, that it's a place of deep complexity, and that complexity reflects the human experience. It's not, maybe things are more intense here sometimes, but they're not, it's not this kind of, it's not like another planet. But it's a place of deep complexity that it's very hard to capture. It's easy to paint in broad strokes and not so easy to communicate how complex it was. So I learned that about Mississippi. About myself, I think, if you had known me, it took me 10 years of talking about it, and probably about 7 years of talking, about 3 years of writing, of looking. But I would have been the girl most likely to talk about writing a book, but not actually write a book. And so I had to kind of reevaluate my image of myself a little bit. And I had to overcome all of those kind of, at least momentarily, because they come back, but all that kind of doubt about the self-doubt, like, who are you to do this? It's too hard, you can't do it. All of those kinds of things. I really had to try to, talk those guys over into the corner and get myself, I learned to manage my time better and to say no to things and to sort of claim a space to work. Because especially as a woman, and I had started 10 years ago, 9.5 years ago, I had a baby, and so that's one of the reasons it took that long. But so there's a lot of internal expectations you have about how you should do things and how you should be to all people. And so I had to kind of let a lot of that go, and so that was a real learning experience too.
Reporting a news story is a sprint. Writing a book is a marathon.
Yes.
How long did it take you from start to finish, and did you ever despair that you could ever do it?
I despaired every day, pretty much. I talked to a counselor about it, and she suggested that I do, and this was great advice, so if you wanted this, that I do what a lot of athletes do, which is to get this kind of, she called it an initiation ritual, which sounds like a fraternity thing, but she said, have a place where you work and get a sequence of things that you go through to get your head in that space and do it every time you sit down to work. And so I kind of developed that, and it, after a little bit, it really worked. To just, okay, when I had gone through those little steps, I was ready to go. And then I just say, I would say BICFOK, which is butt in chair, fingers on the keyboard. And you just go and you say, I would set the timer for 30 minutes and make myself do something for 30 minutes, and then I could take a break. And then you would get into it more and more. So, does that answer your question?
It does. One more, and then we should take some questions from these folks. Kennedy family, through the years, understandably, has learned to guard its privacy very fiercely. They've had to. How hard was it to get the Kennedy family to talk to you and provide helpful information?
Well, it was, so I talked to Kathleen Kennedy, who was the oldest daughter, who had actually written about it in her book, which is a book about faith and politics. But she had a page or so because she remembered very vividly her father coming home, as well as Robert Kennedy Jr. And so I got through to Kathleen first, and again, it was one of those things where you write a note and you email and you call and you John Siegenthaler, that's right. He was the one who broke that dam because he was a close friend of Robert Kennedy's, an aide, and also editor of the Nashville paper. And longtime Kennedy family friend. And so he came down and he remembered Kennedy coming back from Mississippi. And so he said, you want to talk to Kathleen? I'll get you Kathleen. So she said, if John Siegenthaler tells me to talk to somebody, I'll talk to him. So that was how I got with her. But also, again, if you tell somebody how much you liked their book, they're happier to talk to you too. So, and I did like her book. So she was good, but she was a little, she wasn't forthcoming with a lot of details. And then I encountered somebody else who knew Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and actually Senator Eastland's nephew Hiram, and he helped me and I talked to Robert Kennedy Jr. when he was on the phone between planes, so it was a pretty quick kind of thing. And then at some point, I just kept bugging Kathleen to talk to her mom, and Kennedy doesn't give interviews, very rarely ever does. She somehow between me and Hiram and others, she just finally gave up and said, okay, she'll talk to you, I guess. I don't know, but that was I did it by phone, but that was a great interview, and she told me things that nobody else has written about or knew about, and helped me paint the scene of his return within the family in a really powerful way. So I guess cheerful pestering, that's what I call it.
That's Karen. I wonder if there are any questions from our audience. Anybody, raise your hand. Yes, the back.
I'm curious why you chose the scene with JFK where Robert Kennedy is visiting the grave. What significance that had to your story and why you chose to pick that?
Oh, like at the very beginning, in chapter 1. Well, there's a couple of reasons I chose that scene. One, there was some really nice synergy in the dates, because by going back and looking at all the news articles, figuring out significant dates, the morning that Marion Wright testified in Washington, the morning she did that, before that Senate subcommittee hearing, at dawn, they had a reinterment ceremony to move JFK's body to the permanent site with the eternal flame, because they buried him when it happened, and they had to build the monument. And so 3 years later, and so that very morning, that's where, and that night, and so by trying to track sort of his every move, I found some news articles and some things at the JFK library that he and Jacqueline had actually gone out there as the bodies were being moved. He and his brother Teddy went back, and they watched far into the night as they were. And there was an Army defense photographer, because the Army, they had like 250 people guarding it as they were doing this in the middle of the night. They didn't tell anybody. But there was a military photographer, and I found some photographs that he had taken. And so there's the shot that's pretty early in the book where the flame is there, and Kennedy's, it's from the back, and he's just standing there by his brother's grave. He really felt like he was carrying on his brother's legacy. And JFK was not really known for his work on poverty, but at the last cabinet meeting, he had scrawled poverty, poverty, poverty all over the notes, and right before he was killed. And his widow, Jackie Kennedy, had given that to Bobby Kennedy, and he had him framed on his office wall. So I thought that was a useful place to start the book. One, because it was nice that it happened the morning before the thing, and two, it kind of showed how he was just coming into his, still feeling very much a part of trying to carry on what his brother had started that he thought, but then he was kind of coming into his own. Yes.
Yes, right here.
Alan, somewhere I learned when he was coming back into Washington from Mississippi, flight out of Memphis, there was a family birthday.
Right.
They were waiting on him. I think you interviewed Daniel Shore's widow.
Yes.
But somehow, and I hadn't read the book on the tape yet, but somehow the trip was so important, made such an impression, that they spent that birthday time listening or
That was one of the stories that Ethel had noticed, and I happened to notice when I was doing the research before I called her that her birthday was on April 11th, which is the day he was in the Delta, and so he'd flown back. So I asked her about that, and she immediately said, "Oh yes, that's right. It was my birthday, and we let the kids stay up late. He got in about 8:30, and it was 9 o'clock because it was my birthday dinner." And she talked about how festive it was and waiting for him, and he usually came in a real breezy kind of way and talked about the day and how he just stopped and stopped on the threshold, and he sort of stared at his healthy, well-fed children in this beautiful dining room with the china and all of that, and how moved he was to see that compared. And he said to the children, I've just come from Mississippi, and children live there in shacks the size of this room, and they have sores on their body because they don't get the right kind of food. And he said, do something for your country, do something for others, and do something for your country. And she went on to describe how the children started asking questions and that kind of thing. So yes, that was something I was really glad I got, because it's not anywhere else.
So another, yes.
Yeah, I was involved in some of the stuff in the Delta back in the day, but I remember the visceral hatred of the Kennedy brothers. People at my high school cheered when they heard that JFK had been murdered.
Right.
But then in 1968, after Bobby was killed, George Wallace shocked a good bit of the country by getting a large number of votes in the North. He was the former racist governor of Alabama, and all of the blue-collar workers in industrial areas, white workers, were voting for George Wallace. And so the reporters went and asked them why they were voting for George Wallace, and they felt, well, that he cared about them. And they all said they would have voted for Bobby Kennedy if he hadn't been killed. And I think about this recent election, where a lot of the Trump voters in the Midwest were asked, well, we would have voted for Bernie Sanders if she had been the nominee. I just wonder if you have any thoughts on how people that we can't relate to, if we're educated liberals in Oxford, how that relates to what has happened in our country. Anyway.
Well, that is an excellent question, and I think political charisma is a kind of mysterious thing. I think that one of the key things that I heard a lot of people say about Robert Kennedy in his later years after the assassination was a sense of authenticity, and he was very much in the moment when he was, relating to people. But yeah, that's a puzzle. That's the kind of thing that I've puzzled over too. I think often, the simple answer is just that people respond to personality more than they respond to policy, but I don't think that's the only answer.
Okay, I think we've just about run out of time. I just think it's great that an Ole Miss. Thank you. I think it's great that an Ole Miss journalism faculty member writes the book that adds a significant unmanned source of sources, actually, and tells another slice of the Kennedy story, despite all the many books that have come before us. And it's a significant slice of Mississippi history. I just think that's great.
Well, Bill was a huge help, as was Curtis and so many other people on the faculty here. But I want to do one last thing. I want to go and show you, I have some photographs of those children now who live in the Delta. And I really didn't get to talk about that, but I thought you might like to see them. So there's the folks who were opposed to getting any help to the Delta. And today, it's the congressional district, which covers most of the Delta, has the second highest rate of food insecurity in the U.S. And so the numbers are still not good, but there is more of a safety net than there was. It's frayed and it has holes. It's not adequate, but those children then couldn't even get school lunches and breakfast and those kinds of things. So this is Catherine and Mr. Dillard. And Mr. Dillard loved school so much, and he worked many years. And then when the factory he worked moved out of the Delta, he went back and got his GED. And his children, one of them is an optometrist, and another has her master's in education. And so he still lives over in the Delta, but education is really important to him. And this is David White, who was the baby that was on the floor that Kennedy was so moved by. And he had worked, didn't finish high school, but went to Dallas in the late 80s and early 90s when it was booming, and worked a lot of, worked at a hospital in maintenance, and then was, but he, owned his own home and had 4 children, and all of them had finished high school. Well, one of them still in school, but he was installing lights for a dollar store chain, but he's moved back to Mississippi now. But that's what he was doing when I interviewed him. And then Brenda Luckett, and I didn't really talk about her, but she was a child in the Delta in Clarksdale whose parents were a railroad. Where her father worked on the railroad and mother was a teacher, so she was part of the tiny black middle class, and so she gave a really different view. Her parents took her to all the civil rights events. She was an only child, and most of the other children said their parents didn't involve them in that. So she was able to tell me great, and she was a teacher, a special ed teacher that just retired in Clarksdale. So, yes.
Right.